So one of the things that has come up for Ian and I, as well as many in our congregation, is how do we navigate through grief and sorrow during times that produce what feels like a lot of it, more than usual. And yet our typical outlets for processing and marking that grief and sorrow are also not available. And so I know for Ian and I, the person we gave Julian's middle name from died about a month or 2 months after Julian was born. And so great Uncle Bob, still we have not had a service for him, and trying to mark that. And so what was interesting is actually an unexpected marker just happened last week. My uncle was a remarkable fisherman. We have these remarkable journals where he would say he hiked somewhere and found this lake here in Colorado that like no one really had been to, or frequented. And that's where he would fish and all these things. And so we had a friend of ours, as we were selling his fishing gear, buy one of his fly fishing reels and rods. And she took a picture. So she went fishing for the first time, fly fishing. And it has RS Padboy, Robert Stanley Padboy on the handle of the rod. And it was one of the first times since March that it felt like we had some kind of ritual, right? That somebody was able to do something to mark something for our uncle. And we're not the only ones who've lost folks. We're not the only ones who received tough news. And so, or that we haven't been able to have a memorial service or in the ways that we thought we could. How might we understand our emotions? How might we process? How might we learn new markings and rituals that would be meaningful to process that grief and sorrow that we're feeling during these times?
Yeah, well, I mean, first and foremost, that sucks that you lost
Yeah.
one of Julian's namesakes, and haven't had the opportunity to gather with the other people who cared for him and about him, who remembered him well and fondly, and share the stories and experiences that made him special to you all.
Thank you.
And special enough. That's really tough and really hard. I can only imagine, to try to continue to have the story rummage around inside you without the outlets that you expect. And I think you used a great word there, the ritual. You expect to give certain markers or give certain kind of waypoints along the process. I think a couple things just here as I was listening to you. It's important to separate grief and mourning first and foremost in just kind of how we think about the whole process. And that grief is kind of what we do inside ourselves and what we feel inside ourselves, and mourning is what we do on the outside to express what we're feeling inside. And churches, more than anything else, churches are really good at mourning, or at least initiating that mourning process through memorial services or celebrations of life, or other kinds of opportunities, again, for people to gather and tell stories in a particular way. In churches, we tell them through the lens of Scripture and through the lens of sacred texts that are at least either important to us or important to them. And we tend to try to find the spaces in their lives where those scriptures and sacred texts come alive. And so it's an opportunity to mourn in community. It's a ritual for mourning in community. And the thing I think for us to realize is that mourning always happens in relationship.
Mm.
So where grief, it happens, grief happens when we're alone at night and we're remembering and we're reminiscing and we're thinking about the experiences, both of what someone meant to us and what the loss of new experiences means
Mm-hmm.
to us as well. And so, not only with people who are dying, but just any kind of loss that we experience, the loss of freedom, the inability to go out and go to the botanic gardens or to go to an event or go to a restaurant or go to a concert or spend a barbecue with friends and have all the hugs and the handshakes that we want. All of those are losses in many ways, and all of those are appropriate to grieve and appropriate to mourn.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of friends and colleagues of mine and I have been talking about the real extended period of grief and loss that we're having right now, and the impact that that has on us in the long run, especially if we don't find ways like you're talking about to mourn, and find ways to acknowledge what the experience of that person or that, again, event or experience meant to us in ways that help us adapt to what's in front of us now. Um, I think there are a number of ways to mourn, and my hesitation here a little bit is that it's so different for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a lot of times we like to talk about grief in stages, but if you really look at the stages of grief, a lot of those are just emotions that we experience in the grief process.
Mm-hmm.
And really more so than a staged set of emotions. Grief and mourning are about how we dance with the loss. And if you think about how you might dance with a partner, that sometimes you embrace and sometimes you're evading one another and sometimes you're just encountering. And so that idea of kind of coming close to things but not actually engaging it, maybe coming close and fully engaging it, and seeing each other but maintaining a distance. And so that kind of dance for me is really more what the grief process is about. There are times in our lives when we are capable of really embracing what we've lost. And in those moments, really fully embracing what it means to lose something or someone or some experience or some set of future experiences. There are times when we can walk up to it and recognize that it's there, but we can't quite fully embrace it. We can't quite get into that space that we need to. And there are times that we look at it and we really have to avoid it because it's too much, it's too overwhelming. That it's in the middle of the workday and I can't do that right now. All sorts of things that could be going on. And the piece of it is, for me, is that all of those are valid responses to experiencing grief. They're all okay. And they're all perfectly fine. If we're constantly using one, then that's when we get ourselves into trouble. If we're always evading our grief, then it's always going to hover over us, and it's always going to cast, it's going to block our ability to see the things going on around us. If we're only encountering but never really engaging our grief, then we'll be okay, but we won't feel like ourselves. And if we're constantly embracing it, then we become overwhelmed and dependent on that grief to help us move forward. And so the thing is to figure out the rhythm of your process and in your grief. And along with that, what are the ideas, what are the experiences of mourning, again, that happen in relationship? That could be in relationship to the page when you journal. It could be in relationship to pictures that you look at. It could be in relationship to conversations that you have. And in these days, we have to be creative with how we mourn. And that could be something as simple or hard as journaling. Could be starting a group text with people that would have been at a memorial service and checking in with one another from time to time. It could be starting a Facebook wall or a series of Instagram posts where people have the opportunity to post pictures, where again, we're creating space as a community together to share our lived experience of someone or our lived experience of the loss that that we're having at that particular moment. And so, write a letter, write an email, create a caring bridge space, a Facebook wall. Churches can create a space during their worship service for people to write this is what I missed and this is what I'm learning during COVID time. This is what I love, this is what I've lost. Those spaces that allow us to publicly begin to normalize that we're all experiencing some loss, we're all experiencing something different in these moments. And as such, we're better off when we experience it together.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I keep, as you were speaking, it reminded me of how folks are comparing their loss to each other. If their loss is just, they would say just a, whatever that just a is, whether it's, well, it's just a trip or it's just a concert. It's not, I didn't lose my job. I didn't lose a loved one. And yet, and maybe that's part of evading, I'm not sure, but I think it's also this desire not to have self-pity, but self-pity isn't acknowledging emotion. So how can we practice being able to say, I missed this, or this is really a loss for whatever reason, without feeling like we have to qualify the severity or qualify our grief about it compared to somebody else, right? How can we practice that and know that it's not self-pity, right? Where is that distinction maybe that we can help folks talk through?
Right. Well, and I mean, the first thing that pops into my mind is that grief is not a competitive sport.
Mm-hmm.
There are no Olympics of grief where you win the gold if you have the most losses or the most tragedy in your life. And everybody's not competing in the same sport in the first place. And so what may seem like a small loss to some people may actually be a huge loss to other folks. And this is where I think, I mean, for lack of a better term, grace is really important. But more so than that, the big word, the big phrase I would use is empathic imagination. The ability to imagine with empathy what it must be like for someone to experience a loss and to feel vulnerable enough to share it. And to use that as the grounding point or the starting point for conversation, rather than that's not so bad, let me tell you about mine, which is sometimes, or even thinking that's not so bad, mine's so much worse, which gets us in it puts us in a state of automatic disconnection with people rather than connection with people.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can just learn kind of the simple words of that must be really hard, tell me what it's like,
Mm-hmm.
rather than, yeah, that's bad, let me tell you about mine.
Mm-hmm.
And so because that's when we start to get into that comparison or that competitiveness. Yes, we have a hierarchy of griefs that we like to posit that are out there. The difficulty is that we don't live other people's lives for them and with them. We live in relationship to them, and in that relationship, it requires some of that grace. It requires some of that empathy, and it requires some of that imagination to say that our losses may be different, but the feelings of loss may be very similar. If we can actually focus on the feelings and the intensity of feelings rather than the content of the conversation, we can have, I think, deeper and more vulnerable conversations about what it means to grieve and what it means to lose something, and feel connected to people around those conversations rather than feel competitive with people around those conversations. And the other thing that enables us to do is just to stop fixing it. Because usually the comparisons and the competitions there are about, that's fixable and mine is not. And I can fix yours. And that'll give me a little relief from my own grief. We as a culture aren't very good at grief.
Yeah.
I think when I teach or run some grief support groups, one of the things that I learned in some of my research is that the average amount of time that an American feels like someone should be allowed to grieve is 24 hours.
Whoa.
Anything beyond 24 hours and it's considered maladaptive or you're doing it wrong. On the flip side of that, the grief literature says that it takes about 1,000 days to really kind of shift into what life looks like after a loss. And that's not 1,000 days of constantly dealing with it, but that encounter, embrace, evade kind of process. So really about 3 years before we're gathering a sense of, okay, this is what life is like, and I have a new set of routines and a new set of habits, and a new perspective on the loss, so that I can re-engage in the most meaningful ways possible. So there's a great discrepancy between the permission we want to give people to grieve and really what it may take to move effectively through some of those losses.
It's really helpful in a lot of ways, because I think we can apply that to ourselves. If we're the person saying, well, mine's not as bad as theirs, so I should just be grateful, we can also have empathic imagination for ourselves, right? That ability to touch what we're feeling instead of dismissing it or negating it. And I think that allows for us to be present, right? Instead of either wishing what we're going through away, like you were saying at the beginning, what are we moving towards instead of not having that direction?
Right. Well, I think self-compassion is deeply ingrained in some of this. And even if we don't feel comfortable sharing what it is we're grieving, or the emotions that we're experiencing, being in touch with our own sense, being vulnerable with ourselves, being compassionate toward ourselves, offers us a whole nother language for connecting with other people around their loss.
Mm-hmm.
It offers us the creativity and a sense of being able to say, I can't imagine what you're going through, but I can imagine it feels like this. I can imagine it feels angry. I imagine it feels sad. I can imagine feeling alone or uh, whatever it might be. And so some of that self-reflective and self-compassion for what it is we are experiencing
Mm-hmm.
can allow us a better opportunity to connect with others.